Chapter 19. "What is your idea, Dorothy?" asked Tom gravely. This last catastrophe, coming when all danger from the man who had stopped all war seemed past, had sobered us all. "You said there was a mast with wires beside the conning tower of the submarine that time you saw the man, didn't you, Jim?" she asked. I nodded. "Well, that mast was the aerial of a wireless. I don't know what he uses it for, but apparently he has one. Now that we have the Dinkel apparatus fixed to send waves to any given point, we can send off waves of all kinds to Tokyo, calling him and recalling him until we get a wave which his receiver will take. Then we can set up a straight wireless receiving station here to take his answer." "What will you say to him?" Tom asked. "I'll just say, 'To the man who stopped all war. War is over. All nations are disarming. Reply to us.'" "It's worth trying anyway," said Tom, with an air of finality. "I'll go right to work setting up a receiving plant. I can do that all right, but I can't send Morse through our machine." "If you'll look out for the construction end of it, I can send Morse over an ordinary key," I suggested. "Then that's settled," said Tom. "I can set up a wireless that will receive any wave sent from Japan, and I can set up a duplicate of the wave measuring machine that will send messages straight to Tokyo by means of an ordinary Morse key. Where had we better run our aerial?" "Down by the shore," said Dorothy. "We want to avoid the interfering action of the currents that are loose in and around the city." "There's one thing you've forgotten," I interposed. "If the man is in a submarine, your message may not reach him under water." "He'll spend most of his time on the surface," said Tom. "With a first-class submarine, he could spend 2 months under water at a time, but he wouldn't want to." "Don't spend any more time in discussion, boys," interrupted Dorothy. "We must reach him the first moment possible, before any other ship goes down. Meanwhile, Jim, you want to get this to the paper, don't you?" "I surely do," I responded, and I hurried off to wire the London office. I sent my telegram over our private line and waited for the answer. In 5 minutes it came back. "Too late this time, my boy. Japanese first-class battleship disappeared in broad daylight in the harbor of Tokyo. They sent it on here immediately, and we have had it for some minutes. Rest on your laurels." Signed, Maxwell. Well, I thought to myself as I returned, I can afford to rest on my laurels. There's not a country in the civilized world where my name is not known today. My mail was full of requests for interviews, for magazine articles, for lecture tours. I was a made man, and as I mused on these things, I walked on somewhat more proudly than my wont. But as I thought over the experiences of the last months, saw in what an extraordinary fashion fortune had played into my hands, saw how Tom Haldane had saved my life by his shrewd foresight and scientific knowledge, and saw, most of all, how I had profited by my dear girl's quick wit, I became far more humble. Most of all, I had not yet accomplished the one thing I set out to do. I had not found the man who was stopping all war. He still eluded me, and still was carrying on his dread work. I reached our hotel feeling that I was really a very ordinary mortal after all. While I had been gone, events had been moving swiftly. Some miles out from The Hague, there was a little inn on the shore among the dunes over beyond Scheveningen, to which we had twice motored down during the conference. Thoroughly comfortable, a favorite meeting place in summer for the artist colony about the watering place, it was now almost wholly deserted, because of the lateness of the season. We felt it would make ideal headquarters for our work, and soon established ourselves there. Tom was never more in his element than when assembling apparatus, or when controlling men. Here was his chance to do both. Like magic, the tall mast reared its height among the dunes, while coils, wires, and instruments fell swiftly into place. Acting chiefly as a burden-bearer, I ran to and fro, while Tom and Dorothy, with their assistants, brought things to completion. As they came in from the final stain of the aerial, Tom turned to me, wiping the sweat of honest toil from his face. "All ready, Jim," he said. "If you'll start a message over that wire, we'll send it through the ether by means of Dinkel's machine, and drop it straight on Tokyo. Hold on a minute, though. Let me call up my assistant on the wave measuring machine and see if he has heard anything." A rapid conversation over the telephone we had installed resulted. Tom turned back to me. "As yet, I'm thankful to say, nothing happened. The man has evidently been experimenting this morning and was experimenting this afternoon. He's right off Tokyo still. Go ahead. I pressed the key, and the vibrant discharge rattled from pole to pole. Over and over again I gave the call, to the man who has stopped all war. Over and over again I hurled my message out across half a world. For an hour I repeated the call, my eyes and ears waiting for some response from the sounder at my left. "Let's shift the wave strength," said Tom, and they made a hurried series of adjustments. Once more I took up my task, and at 5-minute intervals for 3 hours sent out my call. Again and again we changed the strength of the wave. We struggled with the insensate metal till our heads reeled. At last, about 10 o'clock, we gave up for the day. Dorothy and Tom both were worn out, and both went to their rooms. My head felt too feverish to sleep, so I wandered out for a final pipe along the shore, struggling with the old problem which had been the theme of my thoughts for so long. Who was the man, and how could I find him? Again and again Regnier came to my mind, as I debated the pros and cons of the ever-vexing question. Along the sand, beside the black water, over dune and through the long wiry grass of the hollows I tramped, till the lights of Scheveningen were just ahead. Neither moon nor stars shone forth, and my feet fell noiselessly on the yielding sand. As I crossed the summit of a dune, I stumbled on the prostrate body of a man lying there looking out to sea. I hastened to utter apologies in French, English, and German, but the unknown simply bowed courteously and started back in the direction from which I had come. "Some smuggler, I presume," I said to myself. For want of anything better to do, I may as well dog his steps. On and on in the blackness went my stranger, his head bowed as if deep in thought. By beach and road I followed, till, to my surprise, as we came up to the door of the inn, the man ahead entered without once turning round. I hurried after him, but the only occupant of the wide hall was the proprietor. Mustering my best French, I asked news of the man who had entered. "An Englishman," said my host. "Mad, a little touched here." He laid an expressive finger beside his head. "He has been with me for 2 months. He eats and stays all day in his room. He goes at night and looks at sea." An Englishman? Strange he had not replied to me. But weightier matters oppressed me, and I went to bed, only to pass a troubled night, haunted strangely by my chance acquaintance. Throughout the night he led me in a mad chase, always seeming about to turn into some one I knew and wished to see. But always at the moment of recognition, when I was about to cry his name, he faded, changing into a gigantic, cloudy, unfamiliar form. The morning brought a messenger from the city with our mail, and we each found a package of letters beside our plate at breakfast, one postmarked London, and addressed to me in my own handwriting. I seized and opened eagerly. It was from Hammerly. I had sent him a photograph of Regnier, which I had received only a week before. "Dorothy," I said, "here is a letter from Hammerly about Regnier. As you know, I sent him that picture." "Read it, please," requested Dorothy. I obeyed. Half Moon Street, London, November 2nd. "Dear Orrington, the man who came out of Dr. Heidenmuller's locked room is not the man of your picture. Both are tall and dark, but there the resemblance ends. No allowance for the changes of a year could make them the same. I am sorry that the clue from which you hoped so much should have ended in a cul-de-sac. I see by the papers that the possessor of this dread power has not ceased his awful work. The country here is in a state of wild excitement and fear over the sinking of the Japanese battleship. I sincerely trust that you may soon be successful in your quest. Yours fraternally, Edgar Hammerly." "I knew it," said Dorothy with conviction. "I've told you he wasn't the man from the very first." "Well," ejaculated Tom, stirring his chocolate viciously, "I wish to blazes he was, or at least that we could find out who it is and make him understand that he's a blamed fool." Drinking his chocolate, Tom rose with the remark, "Now I'm going to find out whether the Dinkel apparatus has recorded anything new during the night." A few minutes later he returned, with a negative shake of his head. "Nothing," he said. "Let's get to work." That day passed as had the preceding afternoon and evening. 12 times an hour I sent forth the call. As each hour struck, Tom changed the strength of the wave. The morning passed, the long afternoon waned, and the early night came on. Monotonously, as I pressed the key, my thoughts would range outward into space, peering, searching, striving to find some way to reach the man. My only occupation was the watching of the clock, for Tom and Dorothy were working hard in the next room on plans for altering the wave measuring machine in such a way as to make it even more effective. Directly beneath the clock on the wall, a window looked out to sea, As the evening wore on towards night, a storm rose, and the fierce wind of late autumn drove the breakers with a resounding roar on the long beach. I marked the hour as the storm reached its height, 9:05. I sent my message 9:10. I sent it again, and as I raised my eyes from my key, I looked at the window. There, pressed against the pane, was the face of a man we had long sought. I leapt to my feet. "There's Regnier!" I cried, pointing at the window. The face disappeared as I spoke, and Tom and Dorothy, springing from their chairs, looked out through the panes at the storm. In the hush of the night, the sound of breakers bore in on us insistently. "Wild as a loon," said Tom, shaking his head mournfully in my direction. "Where was he?" asked Dorothy. "Right outside that window," I shouted. "Come, we must find him." We all started for the outer air, but before we could leave the room, the door opened, and Richard Regnier entered. Mental trouble showed in his unquiet look and in his hesitating hand. "Why, Dick," began Tom, but Dorothy, with an emphatic gesture, commanded silence. "I beg your pardon," said Regnier slowly, and with evident difficulty. "I saw you through the window, and I thought somehow I might have known you once, and that you could tell me who I am." Her eyes shining with pity, Dorothy spoke gently. "I'm so glad to see you, Richard. Don't you remember? You are Richard Regnier, and that I'm Dorothy Haldane. You know Tom here, my brother, well, and this is Jim Orrington, whom you met one night in Washington." At Dorothy's low voice, the clouded brow cleared. The curtain rolled from the darkened eyes, and the bent form straightened. "Thank God, I am Richard Regnier. But where am I, and how did I get here?" he asked. "You are on the coast of Holland, near the Hague," responded Dorothy quietly. "I don't know how you got here." "How did you come to be here?" asked Regnier eagerly. "We came to the Hague to the Peace Congress, and we came down here to try to find the man who has stopped all war," answered Dorothy. "The man who destroyed the Alaska and the Dreadnought No. 8? queried Regnier in great excitement. "I have known nothing since that time. Has he done anything since?" "Many things," said Dorothy sadly. "He is doing great harm now, and that is why we are trying to reach him. We ought not to lose a minute more, Jim. If you and Tom will go to work again, I will sit down and tell Richard about the happenings of the last 2 months." Back we went to our tasks, and as I pounded out the message, waited 5 minutes, and pounded it out again, I thought of the strange suspicion under which Regnier had lain. I had believed him the man who had sunk every battleship on that fatal day. I had felt convinced that he was the man for whom we had searched so diligently for weeks, and while we searched, he had been wandering along the sands of the Holland coast. Regnier and Dorothy had sat for perhaps half an hour in earnest conversation, when they rose and came over to us. "Tom," said Dorothy, "Dick has had more experience with wireless apparatus than you have. Suppose you let him look over the whole business." "Glad enough to have him," answered Tom. "It's always possible there may be an error somewhere." Step by step, Regnier examined the transmitting end of the apparatus, passed from the house to the aerial, came back, and went over the receiving end in every part. As he ended, he straightened up. "If you don't mind, Tom, I'd like to change the coherer a little. I should judge that your transmitter was all right, but I question if you could get a reply from Tokyo through the coherer as it now stands connected with that sounder." "Go ahead," said Tom, and I rose from my seat and went over beside Dorothy, while Regnier worked at the powdery mass in the glass tube. He took up the tube at last and held it to the light. "There, let's try that," he said, and placed the tube in its supports, screwing up the terminals. Scarcely had he made the last turn when the sounder broke forth. Clickety clack, 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 clack. Dots and dashes came with the rapidity of a practiced sender. Swiftly I read them off as they came to my telephone receiver. "I am the man who is trying to stop all war. Is your news true? What do you want of me? Why don't you answer?" I jumped to my seat beside the key and sent the answer out into the ether about us. "We have only just got your answer through the receiver. Our news is true. All the nations are disarming. Why do you not seize sinking battleships? Your purpose is accomplished." I had scarcely ended when the reply came back. "When did the nations agree on peace? Who are you?" "The nations agreed on peace and made a solemn covenant that all would disarm 10 days ago. The 4 sending this message are Professor Tom Haldane, Miss Dorothy Haldane of New York, Richard Regnier of Savannah, and James Orrington of New York." There was a perceptible pause this time, before the sounder resumed its motion. Then it began. "I believe what you say. Are the nations living up to their agreements as to disarmament?" "Completely," I replied. "Every one of the nations is living up to the agreement in spirit and in truth. The greatest anxiety which the world feels at present is with regard to your sinking the Japanese battleship, and from fear of your future action." There was a long pause, and then the words came slowly. "How can I allay that fear?" I had been rapidly reading my sendings and my answers to the other three, who sat up looking eagerly at the sounder. As I read off that last question, Dorothy spoke up eagerly. "If he can communicate with us by wireless, why can he not send a message in the same way to all countries?" I passed on the suggestion, and slowly this answer came back. "I will send this message to the ruler of every country. I send it to you first, for you have saved me from causing death unnecessarily. The man who has stopped all war now declares unto you that since peace has come, since every nation is now disarming, he will cease his labors. The ships of the nations may now sail the seas without harm from him. The sailors shall be safe from his hand. This he will do if peace be sure and disarmament be complete. But on the day that any nation violates its solemn oath and arms its citizens, on that day will he rise, and no ship, be it battleship or peaceful merchantman, bearing that country's flag, shall be safe from destruction." The sounder ceased its clamor. Tom spoke in a low voice, as if he feared to be overheard. "How can we tell he is the man, and not someone else who is simply playing with us? We can't afford to take risks. Ask him, Jim, how can we know that he is really the man who has stopped all war?" I turned to my key and sent off the question. Back came the answer. "By the first letter which I erased, and which was found, you shall know me." "That settles it in my mind," I said. "That's known to not more than a dozen people, and none of them would be sending this." Tom, meanwhile, had stepped into the next room, and was talking quietly to his assistant. He spoke to me. "Keep him going a minute, Jim. I want to get a message from him." "Is there anything more you wish to know?" I asked the man by wireless. "Nothing," he replied. "Do you wish to say anything to me?" I could hear Tom's excited voice. "Got it? Just once more, Jim," he said. "There is nothing more," went out from the aerial. "Then I thank you for telling me of this. You have spared me and spared others much by your wisdom. Goodbye," I ended, as Tom stepped from the phone, his face beaming. "Quickest thing on record, that. I got my man to set the machine for the wireless waves the man is using, and got 2 records, both from Tokyo. That settles it once for all." The storm was still at its height. The house rocked with the wind, but the wild moan of the breakers, forgotten while we talked with the man on the other side of the world, now made their presence manifest. The single light within shone on blackened beam and rough-hewn settle, into dim but spotless corners, on glistening tile and dark polished floor. Our little group in modern costume, standing about the table where the instruments were placed, seemed an anachronism. We should have been garbed like Rembrandt's models, and in place of key, relay, and coherer, there should have been simply one massive oaken table. Tom turned to Regnier. "Do you know, Dick, what happened to your head?" "Shh," said Dorothy, looking quickly at Regnier. Regnier smiled as he saw her movement. "You needn't worry, Dorothy. I shall be very glad to tell you all I can." He turned to Tom. "I think the injury to my head came from the man who stopped all war." Chapter 20. "You don't mean that literally," exclaimed Tom. Regnier nodded quietly. "I mean that I believe my memory was deliberately taken from me by the man who stopped all war, when he found I was on the track of his secret. But it's rather a long story, and it's well on towards morning. Shall we have it now, or put off the tale till tomorrow?" "Tonight, by all means," answered Tom. "That is, providing you feel up to it." "I feel perfectly fit now," said Regnier. "So if you all want to hear it, I'll go back to the very beginning and tell it all." We settled down to listen. Tom threw some coal, with a lavish hand, into the small fire pot of the great Dutch stove. "Now this is cozy. Go ahead, Dick, with your yarn." Dorothy, beside me on the big settle, gave my hand one squeeze and echoed Tom's words. "Yes, go ahead, Dick." All the lights had been lowered, save for a single bracket lamp, which shone on Regnier's melancholy but expressive face. As he began, the storm changed its key, and came in steady driving force rather than in great gusts. "It really began that night at Mrs. Hartnell's. he said reflectively. "I was tremendously impressed by that second letter which came out from beneath the visible one, and try as I would I could not shake off a feeling that the message was true, that the man who wrote possessed some strange and awful power which would make it possible for him to do what he threatened. When I left you that night I could not sleep. I looked at the problem from every side, and finally analyzed it down to this. If the man is to do this, he must either be a great scientist himself, or have obtained his secret from some great scientist. I went further. I made up my mind that the most probable line of work to produce such a destroying agent would be along the lines of radioactive experiments. In consequence, I went directly to work, and with the help of 2 assistants, I reviewed all the literature of radioactive matter which had appeared in the last 5 years, and made a digest of the papers, their subjects, and their authors. Then came my time of sailing for abroad, and I took the digest with me. I spent most of my time on the way over in a systematic sorting out of the men who had made the greatest advances, and who would be the most likely to obtain some great result. I finally narrowed my choice down to 5. One of the 5 was Heidenmuller. He had published his last paper in the Zeitschrift für Physikalische Chemie in April, and had published nothing since. As soon as I landed, I hastened to get a file of the magazine, and found that in a somewhat deeply technical paper he had spoken of the possibility that a radioactive agent, powerful enough to give an ultimate resolution of any metal, might be obtained. That was enough for me. I started straight for London and Heidenmuller. As you know, I found him dead, but I heard the story of his death, and I knew by that time that if he had possessed the secret, he must have passed it on to someone else. So I went to work. I did not look up Swinton, because I found that Heidenmuller's first assistant, Gregan, had gone as wireless operator on one of the big yachts, then at Cowes. So I went down there, chartered a small yacht, and spent a week hunting for Gregan. I think I wrote you from there," he said to Dorothy. "You did," she replied. Regnier went on. "Well, to cut that short, I hired Gregan to come back to London with me to make a thorough search of Heidenmuller's laboratories, which I had hired just as they stood. We hunted for 2 days without avail, when one afternoon I went down to the city to do some errands. I came back to my lodgings to find Gregan there, greatly excited. He had found the secret panel in the inner locked room which you found empty. But when he discovered it, the drawers held pamphlets and manuscripts. He had not examined them, as I had given him strict orders not to do so, and his training in the German army had made him ready to obey the orders of his superiors absolutely. I felt that I was on the road to victory, and I wished to read those papers alone, so I told Gregan I should go up there at once, and that he might be free for the evening. After dinner I was delayed for an hour or 2, and reached the laboratory only as darkness was setting in. In my excitement I must have forgotten to lock the door after me. I went at once to the inner room, turned on the incandescents which I had had installed, found the panel easily, pressed the spring, opened the little door whose lock Gregan had already broken, and saw before me a set of 4 drawers. They were filled with manuscripts. I began at the top, and read the titles one by one. Through 3 drawers filled with the record of various researches in radioactive matter and energy I passed. I opened the 4th. There was what I sought. Written in crabbed German script on the top first page of the series was the title. Translated, it read thus: "A determination of a new type of radioactive energy which affects the ultimate decomposition of matter." I seized the papers eagerly, and as I knelt there began the preamble. I had hardly read a dozen words when the light suddenly went out. I started up, the manuscript in my hands, but as I rose I was struck down and half stunned by a blow in the head. To my dazed brain a giant seemed towering far above me, as the room opened to immeasurable distances, and I heard what seemed a sonorous voice, but what was probably the low tones of the man who stopped all war. It is not safe to have the secret in other hands than mine. For this mission I was doomed, and I smelt a strange odour, faintly recalling some of the anaesthetics which belonged to the high orders of the methane series. Then I knew no more. I awoke here in Holland, without memory of my name, without the slightest knowledge of where I was. Here I have remained till you came to bring me back to life and to my senses once more." He ended, and as fitting climax to his strange tale, the lamp flickered out, and the continuous long roll of the storm surged in once more in the fierce tattoo of its full fury. We sat silent for some time, our only light the red ends of our cigarettes. Then Tom spoke. "Anyway, I devoutly trust it's all over now. The end has been accomplished, and the world will be the better for it in the end. Yet it has been at a fearful cost." "Yes," said Regnier, "but a single great war would have meant the death of many thousands more." "One thing I should like to know," said Tom reflectively, "how do you account for your loss of memory?" "I'm not sure," answered Regnier, "but if you remember, there was a paper published by some Germans a while ago, which discussed the properties of an anaesthetic which produced a loss of memory. It was one of the hydrocarbon compounds, and from the odour which came to me, I think my loss of memory may have come that way." "That's a possible solution," said Tom. "At least it will do unless we strike a better. But confound it all, we haven't got the man who has been at the bottom of all this." "Well, the search isn't over yet," interrupted Dorothy. "We can go on with it now." "We will go on with it," I broke in, "but I think we can do it much better from New York for a while." Tom laughed. "Yes," he said, "there's no question that as long as Dorothy has made up her mind to be married in New York is the one place from which to conduct the search for the present. Anyway, I'm not going to Tokyo. I imagine the man will come right back home now." "The Denkel apparatus was the means that stopped the man, after all," I said musingly. "It has done so much that I hope it will do the final thing of all and discover the man." Dorothy rose. "I hope it will," she remarked. "But anyway, we've sat long enough. Now the thing I want to know is what our host has to say of the way Dick came here." That was the question of the next morning, but the innkeeper could tell us little. Regnier had arrived in the company of an Englishman who had paid his board for 3 months, had told them to take especial care of the patient, and had left a package for him. That was all he knew. Regnier seized the package given him, and opened it eagerly. 2 inner envelopes came next, and from the innermost he drew a package of £5 notes. He counted them. "The man didn't intend to have me starve," he said. "Here's £200. He must have given them to me, for I didn't have £5 in my pocket that night." When the messenger came from the city with the morning papers, we read them with avidity. The man had kept his word. Every government had received a wireless message couched in practically the same words as that which he had sent us. The world might rest easy as long as peace reigned. We met in the wireless room after breakfast. "May as well go to work taking this thing down," said Tom. Our work at the Hague was over, and we hastened to pack our belongings and made ready to return to London by the Hook of Holland. To the Savoy we went, a company of 4. Regnier wished to get back into the world and to learn of the state of his affairs. We were anxious to get back to New York by the first steamer we could reach. I was especially anxious, for Dorothy had agreed, after much urging, to marry me a month after we reached New York. There were no relatives to hinder, and Tom, good old chap, seemed almost as glad of our approaching marriage as ourselves. I wanted to get back for another reason too. I had been too long out of the writing game, and I felt that I could not afford to lose the momentum which my work with regard to the man who stopped all war had given me. So we secured passage on a boat leaving Liverpool 3 days after we reached London. The day before we sailed, I found a letter in my mail with the Royal Arms. It was an invitation to James Orrington, Esquire, to be present at the mustering out of the last regiments of the British Army in Hyde Park that morning. "We'll go," said Dorothy. As she spoke, a waiter came to my side. "Gentleman to see you, sir." I smiled as I rose. "That's not so thrilling a message now, sweetheart, as it has been any time these last months." Outside in the corridor was a gentleman of rather distinguished appearance, whom I had not seen before. "Mr. James Orrington?" he said inquiringly. I responded affirmatively. "I am Sir Arthur Braithwaite, one of King's equerry," he said. "He sent you this by me," and he handed me a package and withdrew. I turned away to find Tom and Dorothy just passing. I showed them the package. "Come up to my rooms," said Dorothy eagerly. "We'll open it there. This is just like getting Christmas presents." The outer layers off showed a square white box. I pressed the spring. Within lay a golden cigarette case. Its top held an inscription in exquisitely carved letters: "To James Orrington, Esquire. He served the state before himself." I lifted the case from its bed. Below was a brief note in the king's own hand. Beside the address and signature it bore these words: "I have never forgotten the service you did to England, to the world, and to me." I looked up. Dorothy's eyes were veiled in a mist of tears. She came to me and kissed me. "Dear, I'm so glad, so proud of every bit of recognition. You deserve all of it." And Tom wrung my hand with his old numbing grip, crying, "Bully for you, old man. That's the first bit of furniture for the new house." There was just time for us to reach Hyde Park before the review, and we all three crowded into a hansom and sped away. Thousands surrounded the reviewing field, and it was only with difficulty that we found our way through. Our card of invitation worked wonders, however, and with that marvellous command of crowds which the London police possess, we finally came through and found ourselves at the reviewing stand, just as the band announced the coming of the troops. The foot guards first, with that strange down-thrust of the foot, relic of the marching step of many decades ago, then the Scots, then regiment after regiment, till the whole field was covered with the pride of Britain's troops in their most gorgeous panoply of war. The king, in field marshal's uniform, stood at the centre. What thoughts must have racked his brain as he stood there silent, erect, immobile? What visions of the long line of English sovereigns, what memories of the thousands of reviews of centuries past, when Britain's soldiers left for wars of conquest, or returned, bearing new laurels, offering new lands to the great island empire. The music ceased. As if by one accord, the ensigns of the regiments, bearing the old flags, torn by shot and shell, revealing in golden scroll the record of British prowess, came to the front and centre. Then in one long line forward came the colours. The king saluted, and they turned and formed a compact mass of brilliant colour on the right. I heard a whispered question and answer. "What is to be done with the colours?" "They are to go to the Abbey for a chapel of the flags." I watched the pageant, breathless. A hoarse command, and the troops stacked arms. Another, and the music started up. Proudly, defiantly, in perfect formation, the troops wheeled and started the march past, their empty hands swaying at their sides. As they passed, the king saluted with raised hand, the officers' swords rising and falling with regular rhythm. As they passed the gleaming mass of colour where stood the flags, they saluted once more. I could see the tears streaming from the rugged cheeks of many a war-worn veteran, and my own throat contracted at the spectacle. The king stood motionless at the salute, as they formed after the march, and stood for the last time in those ranks which had so often faced the foe. The general commanding turned and raised his sword. Cheer upon cheer broke forth for the king, and I found myself with Tom, good Americans as we were, cheering wildly, though with dry throats. The king raised his hand, and the sound ceased. He said but a single sentence: "Soldiers of the British Empire, my soldiers, farewell." Once more the cheering broke forth, but through the sound came music, and troop by troop they wheeled and marched away. Not till the last man had gone did the king move, and when he turned I could see his face white and drawn with the agony of the hour. He walked heavily to his carriage and drove away, lifting his hat mechanically in response to the salutation of the crowd. That night Regnier dined with us. I had never seen him so gay, so brilliant. He was full of his plans for an expedition to the Ural Mountains in search of some new deposits of platinum, for which he had obtained a grant from the Russian government. He was the life of our party, and we parted from him with regret. As he left, I walked out into the courtyard with him. He turned suddenly. "Orrington," he said, "you've got the finest girl in the world to be your wife. You're not good enough for her. Nobody is, but I'm sure you'll make her happy. I've loved her for 5 years. I knew from the very first I had no chance. Goodbye, and God bless you both." I stood and watched him till he passed through the arch and was lost in the roaring tide of the Strand. "Poor chap," I said musingly as I turned away. "Poor chap." The voyage home was uneventful. The month before the wedding we spent chiefly in making plans for our new home, which was to be a country home. Slowly dragged the days before the wedding. 20 days, 15, 10, 5. At last it came. As Tom and I came up to the church on the wedding day, the snow was lying on the narrow lawn, crusting the roof and eaves with glittering crystals, and turning the ivy to a soft, clinging cloud. The flooding sunlight transmitted through the 2 great windows of the tower, threw strange hues on the white tapestry and carpet of late winter. From within sounded the full diapason of the organ, breaking into rivers and floods of melody as the organist practised his prelude to the wedding march. We swung back the door to find ourselves in the midst of a group of ushers, who fell upon me with one last volley of cheering and jeering remarks as I hurried through. I hastened by them, laughing, and passed with Tom to the tiny room beside the organ, where we were to wait till the moment that Dorothy came. After much discussion, it had been determined that Dorothy's uncle should give her away, while Tom acted as best man. "It gives me rather more a share in the proceedings," he said. "I always like to have something doing." The body of the church was hidden from our sight, but just before us rose the altar, lit by brazen candelabra, which rested upon the altar cloth hanging in heavy folds, and reached to the great mullioned window overhead, from which the Christ looks down in silent benediction. As we sat waiting, I breathed a silent prayer that I might be worthy, that our life together might be consecrated to loving service, that we might— Tom's voice broke in on my half-formulated thoughts. "See the Alpha and Omega embroidered on the cloth?" I nodded. "And the Alpha of the whole thing came that day in Washington, when you read the letter from the man. Here's a part of the Omega, the beginning and the end. How little you could dream of all that has come when you left your office to look up some stupid transports, or Dorothy imagined it when she went down to standardize that radium. But the end will never be complete till we find the man. While he roams the earth with his secret, the world is never wholly safe." So the thread that had bound Dorothy and me together wove into our wedding hour. Our conversation ended there, however, for at that moment a low bell tinkled, the first bars of the march began, and I started forward to meet my bride. Quietly, reverently, happily, Dorothy and I took up our life together. Dorothy was never more beautiful, never more womanly and sweet than when she said "I do" in her low voice, and turned towards me with a look of loving confidence. We had 2 weeks in the South, and then came back by special request to the Haldane house on the Long Island shore, where Tom had set up the wave measuring machine in a laboratory which he had built on a bluff just above the beach, and in which he was still at work on new ideas. The morning after we arrived, Dorothy and I went out after breakfast to find Tom, who was bending over an inner cylinder of the machine, while the belt of metal quietly revolved. "Got the whole thing set up just as we used to have it, haven't you?" I said. "Yes," said Tom. "I'm always on the lookout for the man, and then too I've got a notion that I can make some changes in the recording apparatus that will make computation easier." "Has the man been experimenting at all lately with his high waves?" asked Dorothy. "Yes," answered Tom. "I leave the machine adjusted for them every day, but I've only heard from him twice. I always keep 2 or 3 uncharged reflectoscopes on hand as well. Some day he may go to experimenting where I can get a hold of something." I stood looking lazily out of the window. A large yacht lay just offshore, her white sides glistening in the morning sun. There was a touch of spring in the winter air. Suddenly, before my horror-stricken eyes, the yacht changed to a confused mass of boards which rose and fell on the tide. I heard a cry from Tom and Dorothy. "The man!" I turned. The golden ribbons of the reflectoscopes once more stood stiffly separate, and the moving belt stood still. The beam of light was just fluttering to rest almost on the zero. "Out there, right out there!" I shouted. "Come on!" And throwing open the door, I rushed towards the beach, followed by the others. I pointed to the mass of wreckage rising and falling on the tide. "There, there!" I shouted. "He just destroyed that yacht." "There's a survivor!" cried Tom, as we ran stumbling on over the rocks and sand towards a plank which bore a living man towards the shore. Just as we came to him, he struck bottom and groped forward on his hands and knees through the waves. He reached the dry sand, rose, and walked towards us. I looked at the man in amazement. I knew those features. yet they were so strangely drawn and fixed, so dominated by the dread compelling power of the eyes, that I paused. Then it came to me. "John King!" I cried in amazement. King came steadily onward. A lightning flash illumined my brain. "Are you the man who stopped all war?" I cried eagerly. Dorothy reached my side and clung to me as John King advanced with hesitating steps. "I am," he answered slowly. Then why did you destroy the yacht?" shouted Tom, stammering in his excitement. How have you lived when the others perished?" "The time to end has come," said John, in muffled, solemn tones. "I alone am immune. I did not think I was." As he spoke, a still more awful change began to pass over his features. He staggered, stopped, and put his hand to his brow. "I am the last victim," he went on falteringly. "I pay the final price." The last words came in a thick gasp. "My secret is safe." As he said that, he fell, and when we reached him, he lay dead. The expression of his face had changed again. The somber, awful majesty which had illumined it was gone. He looked once more like the young lad I had known and loved in years gone by, whose face so well expressed his noble spirit, ever impatient of injustice and wrong. After the weary struggle, his soul was once more poised and at rest. The world and the man who stopped all war were both at peace.